On behalf of Terry, I extend a warm welcome to all our esteemed panelists and attendees to our pre-conference webinar series for the month of July. The pre-conference webinar series are designed to highlight the need to accelerate adaptation action in today's uncertain times. Today's webinar on SAPCC as the driver of mainstreaming climate change adaptation into subnational and local planning will, among other key points, seek to deliberate on India's experience with formulation of SAPCCs and the associated implementations. Before we begin, I would like to make a few housekeeping announcements. Today's webinar is being recorded and is also being streamed live on YouTube. You are welcome to revisit the content yourself and share it with your colleagues. This webinar will run for 2 hours. During this time, we request our audience to keep their cameras switched off and their mics muted at all times. Attendees are encouraged to post questions in the Q&A box or the chat box at any point during the webinar. While these will be addressed during the dedicated Q&A sessions, speakers are also encouraged to answer these through the Q&A box or the chat box. I now invite Ms. Soumya Bhatt, Advisor Climate Change at GIZ, to introduce and welcome our first speaker.
Thank you, Meghla. A very good afternoon and good morning to everyone who has joined us today from different time zones. It's actually quite heartening to see that so many people have already joined on a Friday evening, afternoon, or morning for the interesting webinar on state action plans on climate change. So moving ahead with the webinar, as a result of the growing recognition that climate change is underway and certainly poses serious risks for both human societies and natural systems, mainstreaming climate change has become increasingly central and also imperative for any policy planning and implementation at all levels of governance. And this certainly also calls for an urgent need of coherence between climate change planning at the national, subnational, and even district and the village level. With this, let's move forward with the agenda. We have a very experienced and distinguished set of speakers with us today to share and deliberate on some of the most pressing issues on climate change adaptation planning and mainstreaming. The agenda is broadly divided into two sections, starting with an inaugural, which will be followed by an engaging panel discussion. So moving ahead with the inaugural first, on behalf of both GIZ and Terry, it is my pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished speakers for the webinar, starting with Mr. Philip Kinnell, who is Head of Division India and South Asia at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. We have Dr. Subrata Bose with us, Scientist F at the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change. We have Mr. R.R. Rashmi, Distinguished Fellow and former at TERI and former Special Secretary, MOEFCC. Mr. Mohammed Al-Khawad, Cluster Coordinator, Environment, Climate Change and Natural Resource Management with GIZ. We are also delighted to welcome our GIZ project state partners who have joined us today. Mr. Ashish Tiwari, Secretary, Department of Environment, Forests and Climate Change with the Government of Uttar Pradesh, and Dr. Suresh Atri, Principal Scientific Officer with the Department of Environment, Science and Technology, Government of Himachal Pradesh. A very warm welcome to all of you. And moving forward with the agenda now, let us have the pleasure of listening to the official opening remarks by Mr. Mohammed Al-Khawad, GIZ Cluster Coordinator for Environment, Climate Change and Natural Resource Management. Mr. Al-Khawad has more than 20 years of experience in environment and climate policy issues in several capacities with GIZ in Morocco and Germany, also with German ministries of environment, education, agriculture, transport, and infrastructure. Welcome, Mr. Al-Khawad. The floor is yours now.
Thank you. Thank you, Soumya, for the kind and hearty introduction. And thank you everybody for being here and participating at this evening, at this late afternoon. On behalf of GIZ, I'd like to welcome first all panelists and participants for being part of this webinar on subnational climate change action planning. The webinar will focus on, well, the state action plans on climate change, the so-called SAPCCs, and in how far they act and can act as a driver for mainstreaming climate change adaptation into subnational and local planning. Now, climate change is posing, I think it's understood, many risks, especially for vulnerable communities who depend on natural resources. The Global Climate Risk Index, also known, ranks India as the 5th most at-risk country due to climate change. Now, India's national determined contribution, the NDCs, aim at reducing climate risks for vulnerable population groups and sectors by reducing national emissions and, of course, enhancing climate change adaptation. So, the state action plans on climate change, the SAPCCs, are a very crucial policy response in this direction and are intended to support India's climate action at the state level by integrating climate change concerns into policies, plans, and programs. The SAPCCs also aim at mainstreaming climate change into action plans, climate change action into local level planning. Since the development of the first SAPCCs, 2011 to 2013, several states in India have demonstrated innovative approaches and mechanisms to, implement climate action and mainstream climate action into development policies and programs. It's not an easy task, and that's why one has to be innovative also. And we have played a role in that. GIZ has been and has the pleasure and the privilege as well, of course, to cooperate with several Indian states in preparing and implementing the SAPCCs. Further, we have, of course, the pleasure that at the national level, Indo-German bilateral cooperation has been active on the topic of climate change adaptation since 2009, and here, of course, working with the Indian Ministry of Environment, Forest, and Climate Change. So I think the setting is really good. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a right time to discuss this. And the webinar, which has been organized by, of course, MOFCC and GIZ together, thank you for that, has 3 pretty neat objectives. First, share experience on 10 years of SAPCC formulation and implementation. Yeah, share experience. Further, discuss the dynamics of SAPCCs as a driver for mainstreaming climate change. And I think that's really the hidden agenda we want to all have. The SAPCCs are the driver for mainstreaming climate change. And last but not least, the last objective, evaluate pathways for downscaling SAPCC to the district and the village level. To conclude again, pleasure to be here, pleasure to be with you, and a welcome to all those who are present and behind the scenes at this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Al-Khawad, for your valuable words and also wonderfully setting the tone for the session now. I would now, moving ahead with the agenda, it is great pleasure to now invite Mr. Philip Kennel, Head of Division India and South Asia with German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, to give his views on Indo-German development cooperation and climate adaptation. Mr. Kinnell is an economist by training and has been working with BMZ since 2000 in several functions, including cooperation with West Africa on policy and development effectiveness, on environment, and as head of cooperation at the German embassy in Bolivia, and also head of division for the climate policy at BMZ. Once again, Mr. Kinnell, a very warm welcome to you, and the floor is yours now.
Ms. Pat. Thank you, colleagues, for inviting me to this event. Distinguished colleagues from the Indian government, from the state governments, and all other distinguished panelists and guests, really. I think there's a big audience also in this event. So it's a pleasure to be with you and to support the important work of India and the states and the subnational government on adapting to climate change, on taking climate change serious as an issue that needs to be mainstreamed actually in all our work in the economy, in the society, be it different sectors like agriculture or infrastructure or energy. So it's everywhere, and it will be the challenge of the 21st century to address. And in that challenge, actually, India and Germany and the EU and actually the whole world is in the same boat. There are different implications in different areas, in different regions of the world, but still, I think we face the same issues, and we need to strongly work together to overcome this challenge on adapting to climate change, but for sure at the same time as well on mitigating climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. Let me very quickly stress that Indo-German collaboration has a very long history, and we are really happy to be in this subject since 10 to 20 years now with the Indian government jointly. The latest sixth intergovernmental consultations between Prime Minister Modi and Chancellor Merkel had to be delayed or postponed for COVID reasons, but we hope to have them soon again. At that occasion, actually, there was work on both sides to increase collaboration on climate and SDGs, including for sure the adaptation issue. And we will certainly continue on these lines with a special focus on solar collaboration, solar partnership, with a special focus on agroecology and natural resources, including for sure adaptation to climate change, and with a special focus also on other issues that are related to climate change mitigation and adaptation. It is important, I think, that we see this as a long-term effort. So in any case, from the German side, we consider it exactly as that. And we are happy to have a strong partner with MOEFCC and many other line ministries actually as well in India on this subject. This is a whole of government challenge for Germany as much as for India. Let me quickly say a few words on what we do in Germany and the EU on adaptation. There's a German strategy for adaptation since 2008, which exactly actually reflects also many of the key characteristics of the Indian approach, including subnational governments, putting subnational governments, being it municipalities or states, in the driver's seat of adapting to climate change, giving strategic guidance, improve data, improve planning, and then do the right investments in order to avoid sunk investments that are not useful in the context of climate change, but are forward-looking and taking into account the new challenges. And it again concerns all sectors, be it soils, be it agriculture, forestry, fishery, energy, traffic, urban development. So it's everywhere, and we need to deal with it. At the same time, at the EU level, we have established a new strategy in February this year, which looks at the EU strategic lines for adapting to climate change. It is integrating adaptation into macro fiscal policies. It is also looking at nature-based solutions for sure for adaptation, and local adaptation action again there is key, because there it's finally where people need to face the challenge really. Finally, just 2-3 pieces of information on the concrete Indo-German collaboration. On the subject, for sure, we will talk, or you will talk much more eloquently than I can on the SAPCCs and the joint work and what India is taking forward on the different levels. There's also important work in Himalayan states on forest and adaptation via our technical and financial cooperation. I have already mentioned agroecology approaches, be it in the north or in the south of India, in the different ecosystems. We would be happy to take this more forward, even more forcefully with the Ministry of Agriculture and have a very strong dialogue and ties in that respect at the moment ongoing. And there's important work, I think, also in the urban sector when it comes to stormwater management, very concrete collaboration in Chennai. But the issue is much broader than that for sure and needs to be mainstreamed, let's say, extreme events and how to tackle them in all the urban areas. There's a strong collaboration also on rebuilding Kerala in this respect between India and Germany. And finally, we think that risk finance and risk insurance or climate risk insurance is key when it comes to deal also with loss and damage in terms of climate change. There's the Injury Resilience Global Partnership that looks at concepts and also financing for this kind of action. And we have a strong collaboration already with MOEFCC and others in India on this subject, including agricultural crop insurance, including also an exchange platform on latest information and, let's say, concepts on this. And there are many, be it public or private financing channels also to take this forward, to mobilize people and money for risk finance arrangements, so that when a disaster hits, we are prepared to bail out, to repair damages, and have also the right incentives in place to avoid in the first place for sure damages and loss in that respect. Thanks a lot for this seminar and for the leadership actually by India on this subject. We know that without India, the global climate challenge and the global SDG challenge will not be solved. And we also see India as a very active partner on this subject. We are very much looking forward to the G20 presidency of India. And we hope actually that we can support a very ambitious stance from India on this subject of climate change and climate mitigation. And I'm very much looking forward to the seminar and to your inputs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kinnell, for your remarkable words and also valuable insights, not just on the India-German collaboration, but also highlighting the fact and emphasizing on the importance of sharing more on climate change, adaptation, and also mitigation in the future. Thank you once again. And now I would like to move ahead with the agenda. And we have now Dr. Subrata Bose, Scientist F, with the Climate Change Division of Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change, joining us to share his insights and experiences on adaptation planning in India. Dr. Bose has a rich experience in biodiversity and climate change policy landscape in India, and has also been part of different strategic groups on strengthening skill and entrepreneurship landscape with the Niti Aayog. He has also represented India at the climate change negotiations of the UNFCCC. Welcome, Dr. Bose, and over to you for the presentation.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon to everyone. And based on the time zone, it may be good morning or good night. So to start with, thanks for inviting me in this webinar. SAPC driver of mainstreaming climate change adaptation into subnational and local planning. So in this presentation, next, please. So briefly, I will cover this context, SAPC development, revision of SAPC, and process and way forward. Next, please. So considering the context, basically, if we look at the physiogeographic nature of the country, we are facing natural disaster in each year, and adaptation is an important issue. There are communities, ecosystem, and sectors like agriculture, mountain ecosystem, tribal and rural communities, and coastal areas that are highly vulnerable to impacts of climate change and have limited ability to adapt. Further, about 55% of our country's population is depending upon agriculture and allied sector, and more than 300 million people have a high dependence on forest sector for their livelihoods. The adverse impact on water availability due to recession of glacier, decrease in rainfall, and increased flooding in certain pockets may threaten food security, livelihoods, and critical private and public infrastructures. The regions of the Himalayas, the Western Ghats, the coastal regions, the northeastern region of the country are highly vulnerable to impacts of climate change. Over the year, India has made large-scale concerted effort to institutionalize the adaptation to climate change through the development and implementation of National Action Plan on Climate Change and a State Action Plan on Climate Change. These are the overarching guiding documents that identify the needs, priorities, and means of implementation of climate actions. Out of 8 national missions outlined in National Action Plan, 5 missions are focused on adaptation efforts, sustainable agriculture, increasing water use efficiency, sustaining the Himalayan ecosystem, creating sustainable habitat, and Green India mission. This mission also has significant co-benefit to mitigation, biodiversity conservation, poverty eradication, and sustainable development. So in addition, the climate change is not a subject that can be addressed in isolation by one ministry or department, and it requires active interdepartmental cooperation and coordination. The subnational actions are critical in addressing climate change due to their proximity to face the consequence of climate change. It is the people at the bottom, they suffer more. Apparently, the subnational stakeholders seems to be local in nature, but then benefits are distributed globally. So in the context of adaptation, subnational actions are more important. Next, please. So when I talk about State Action Plan on Climate Change, basically it all started with the establishment of Prime Minister Council on Climate Change in 2007, and NAPCC was launched with 8 missions in 2008. And to support the NAPCC efforts and to mainstream climate change initiative at state level, the State Action Plan on Climate Change was launched in 2012-13. Next, please. So when we talk about the climate change governance structure, it is basically the Prime Minister Council on Climate Change and the Executive Committee on Climate Change. They develop the coordinated responses on issues relating to climate change at national level, providing oversight for formulation of action plans in the area of assessment, adaptation, and mitigation of climate change, and periodically monitor key policy decisions. And I must say that in the 7th Executive Committee on Climate Change held in February 2021, more focus was given in the meeting for the revision of SAPCC and NAPCC. And when we talk about the bottom side of this structure, the State Action Plan, basically the decentralized climate change governance and inclusive approach is demonstrated at State Action Plan. Further, with the Adaptation Fund on Climate Change, the state governments are showing greater interest in addressing and implementing concern issues of their states and or UTs. Next, please. So we have finished the SAPCC 1, and we have already finalized 33 states and UTs action plan. And we achieved this institutional framework developed almost in all states and UTs. Capacity of the states and UTs has been enhanced, and SAPC supported mainstreaming development plan of the state or UTs and supported access to national or international finance, and it has provided a linkage to the SDG. Next, please. So when we talk about achievement, there are some constants as well, and the major constants are complexity of climate science. We still don't understand in full the complexity involved in climate change science. And there is knowledge gap for scientific understanding, technical capacity at different level, and more importantly, the allocation of budget, sources of funding. So these are major concerns we are facing in this. Next, please. So why we are going for a revision? Basically, the goal of Paris Agreement is to limit the global temperature rise to below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level, and to pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And to meet this obligation under the Paris Agreement, India has submitted national determined contribution with 8 different goals and 3 quantifiable goals related to emission reduction, renewable energy, and forestry. So all these 3 goals are reduce emission intensity of its GDP by 33 to 35% by 2030 from 2005 level, to achieve about 40% cumulative electric power installed capacity from non-fossil fuel based energy resources by 2030, to create an additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon equivalent through additional forest and tree cover. So the NDC was submitted in 2015, and the implementation of Paris Agreement starts from this year. And in between, the scientific and socioeconomic understanding and knowledge on climate change has advanced over the last few years. The dedicated climate change institution established in almost all states and UTs, with active support of scientific and academic research institutions. Several studies have been carried out, and sectoral vulnerability studies highlighting the impacts of climate change are almost established or going on. So thus, with the adoption of Paris Agreement, national and international climate action and policy landscape has evolved. In addition to climate change, there are some linkages of sentence and framework, Kigali Amendment on Montreal Protocol, and new initiative of Government of India. All these factors are supported to ask the state government to go for a revision of their SAPC submitted earlier. So ministry has already requested them, and the process is going. Next, please. So how it is going on? Basically, ministry has provided guidelines for preparing, revising the SAPCCs, and there are financial support of raised 20 lakhs for revising the SAPCC. State government can avail that to revise their already submitted SAPCC, or if they have not submitted earlier, they can go for a fresh one. We are in the process of the finalization, and we have received some of the draft proposal, and we are still awaiting, and we are following with the state and duties, and hopefully in the next, within this year or next year, we may have almost all of them ready. So I must say, SAPC is basically a strategy at state level in line with the objectives of the NAPCC. The enhanced capacities and improved understanding of sectoral and regional climate variability and projections, GHG emissions, long-term variability, mapping vulnerable regions, social groups, sectors will help identify and prioritize mitigation or adaptation strategies and refining specific action plan and strategies. In this context, SAPCCs need to be revised and strengthened further, considering the evolving context of climate science, policies, and actions. This was the basic understanding behind this revision, basically. So this is the next content. And next, please. Next, please. And this is how we are moving forward, basically. Next, please. And this is the process how they will state will evolve their SAPCC document, basically, while preparing the document. Next, please. So now the way forward. So SAPCC may include the current and future scenarios and likely impact of climate change, identification of vulnerable areas, sectors, and communities, and associated risks. This strategy necessarily is based on the existing activity and additional requirement to meet the challenges of climate change. In view of this, SAPCC could be a part of annual development plan of the state. Specific program activities project envisaged under the SAPCC will need to be funded in course of implementation of a state action plan in various sectors, and the resources may be mobilized, provided through budgetary or bilateral multilateral financing channels, including EAP component of the state plans. Various activities under SAPCCs need to be part of plan scheme of the state. So how the states can develop their plan and the financial requirement may be part of their regular plan scheme of the state. So MOF's role will be as a nodal ministry will be monitoring the implementation of various activities envisaged in the SAPCC and will act as a repository of information relating to climate change. Thank you all for inviting me in this webinar. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bose, for sharing your insights and also experiences of working on climate change adaptation and state action plans on climate change. Also taking us through the historical background on SAPCCs and also way forward. And I think you have just set the right stage to now transition smoothly into the panel discussion, which will deep dive into certain challenges and constraints and also a way forward that you already spoke about. Thank you once again. And I would once again like to thank all the distinguished speakers and move forward with the agenda. Sorry, after the interesting inaugural, we have very prominent expert panel with us today. And I now have the pleasure to invite Mr. R.R. Rashmi, who will be chairing the panel. Mr. Rashmi is a former Special Secretary with the Government of India and currently a distinguished fellow at TERI. He has been India's principal negotiator for climate change at the UNFCCC for several years and has been an eminent part of climate change policy making in India, being closely associated with several policies relating to climate change, pollution, Montreal Protocol, and environmental clearances. I will give a brief introduction to the panel before handing to the panel chair. And I would also request all the panelists to switch on their cameras as I introduce them briefly. So the expert panelists for the day are starting with Mr. Chandra Bhushan, Chief Executive Officer at the International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology, iForest. Mr. Bhushan is one of India's foremost environment and climate change experts and has researched extensively on issues ranging from climate change, energy transition, and also rights of mining affected people and natural resource management. He has worked closely with countries to influence outcomes at the UNFCCC level and the Montreal Protocol, and was also conferred with the Ozone Award by the UN Environment in 2017. Welcome, Mr. Chandra Bhushan. I would now like to welcome Mr. Lokendra Thakkar, General Manager at the Center for Climate Change and Sustainable Development, and also Senior Scientific Officer with the Environment Planning and Coordination Organization, Government of Madhya Pradesh. He is currently leading the team at the state to revise the state action plan on climate change. And also under his leadership, the State Knowledge Management Center on Climate Change won the first prize at the National Water Mission and also the Times of India Earth Care Award. These are two of the most prestigious national awards on climate change in India. Welcome, Mr. Thakkar. Moving to Dr. Suresh Atri. Dr. Suresh Atri is currently Principal Scientific Officer, Department of Environment, Science and Technology, Government of Himachal Pradesh. Dr. Atri has extensive experience in the field of environment management and climate change. He is currently working also as a state coordinator for climate change, coordinating several climate change adaptation projects nationally and internationally, including the state action plans on climate change. He is one of the pioneers in climate change vulnerability assessments in the state of Himachal Pradesh, adaptation planning, and also greenhouse gas inventorization at the state level. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Atri. The next panelist is Dr. Indu Murthy. She is a principal research scientist at the Center for Study of Science, Technology and Policy, C-STEP, Bangalore. Dr. Murthy is leading adaptation and risk analysis work at C-STEP, and formerly she has worked as a consultant scientist at the Indian Institute of Sciences for over 2 decades. She is also a UNFCCC GHG inventory review expert, member of the IUCN Commission, and International Platform on Adaptation Metrics. She has also published extensively and is a contributing author to the IPCC. Welcome, Dr. Murthy. Moving to Mr. Kirtiman Avasthi. Mr. Kirtiman Avasthi works as the Senior Policy Advisor for Climate Change and Climate Finance at GIZ India. Mr. Avasthi is a climate change and sustainability professional working at GIZ India, where he is responsible for climate change adaptation and climate finance readiness portfolio of GIZ. He has long-standing experience of strategic planning, policy advice, community support, resource mobilization, and also knowledge management, covering issues of climate adaptation, climate risk management, climate finance, DRR, and sustainable development as part of bilateral, multilateral, and non-governmental organizations. His work primarily focuses on subnational adaptation planning, where he worked on development, operationalization, and also revision of state action plans on climate change in India. Welcome, Mr. Avasthi. And now I would like to hand over to the panel chair and facilitator, Mr. Rashmi, for taking forward the panel discussion. The floor is yours now, Mr. Rashmi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samya. I hope I am audible clearly to everyone.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be here in this session. And I'm glad to see you, so many colleagues here, former and present, to discuss this very important issue of how we can mobilize state actions or actions at the state level in the interest of addressing climate change. On behalf of Terry and on behalf of all of you, let me welcome all the participants once again. You have already introduced them, so I'll not go there again. We are fortunate to have 3 distinguished representatives from the state governments who will present to us their perspective on what is happening at the state level in terms of state action plans. We have from a national and civil society perspective, we have Mr. Chandrabhushan, who will present to us the outside view of how the governments at different levels are working in the area of climate change. And then we will have, from a more technical and academic perspective, Dr. Indu Murthy will tell us what is it that might be needed to enhance understanding of climate change at the state level and how we can advance those actions. Now, let me give you a brief perspective before I come to the issues for this session. I was fortunate to be associated with the process of evolving a framework for state action plans in 2010. And the concept of state action plans was got formalized immediately after the National Action Plan on Climate Change was launched. And very soon it was realized that the 8 missions which were launched under the National Action Plan, 3 of them clearly had mitigation content, and the 4 of them had largely adaptation content, but some of them, of course, they also had mitigation. For example, forestry, it's both a carbon sink as well as it has an adaptation perspective dimension. So, and then the last one was on climate, strategic knowledge on climate change, which is about climate science. So the national policies, of course, remain focused on mitigation. On the adaptation side, the various sectors like agriculture, water, Himalayan ecosystem, the urbanization process, and things like that, they are mostly in the domain of the state governments. The actions take place at the state level, and the policies are also laid down at the state level. So it was felt that it is important, while we have missions focused on adaptation at the national level, unless we have an action framework at the state level, these missions will get nowhere. These missions would simply agglomerate the current actions which are in the realm of rural development or urban development or agriculture development or conserving water. These all have climate impacts, but they're all diverse, they're all disjointed. There will be no common, there will be no synergy. So it was important that the states understood this and they evolved a synergistic framework for driving their actions into those areas where the impact will be maximum from climate change point of view. That's how the state action plans came into being. But but there were 2 important gaps from a now that we have the benefit of hindsight, I can say that there were 2 clear gaps when we evolved this framework, and Dr. Subrata Bose also has referred to this in his presentation partially. One was about financing, the budget. There was no clear guideline about how these state action plans will be funded. After all, the state governments are always stressed in terms of resources, and they have to fight their own developmental problems. So any scheme which expects them to divert resources for the purpose of climate change in the name of a national action plan or state action plan, it's an extremely difficult call. And then there was no financing framework for this visualized in these state action plans. The second was, and I do feel that this is an important issue, that in terms of actual impact of these actions, there was no monitoring framework. There was no evaluation and monitoring framework, just like something similar to what we have for mitigation actions. In terms of mitigation actions, we have clearly defined parameters. We have outcomes which can determine the efficiency or effectiveness of mitigation actions. But we don't have a similar framework in case of adaptation. So I think it will be important that in the years to come, the evolving framework of state action plan takes these issues into account. I'm sure when the state government representatives comment, they may add their own perspective to this. The question now in the new version of state action plan which is being attempted is that of mainstream, which Mr. Kill was pointing out. So when we look at, when we have the objective of mainstreaming climate actions into state actions or state policy, what is it that we need to be built into these state action plans? What is it that can be done from different angles? And clearly, as Dr. Bose was pointing out in his presentation, the issue is that of reviewing the existing developmental plans and finding the hooks or the places where we can build action climate oriented action plans, and then identify the incremental actions which can form part of the regular developmental plans. Unless we are able to do this, the sectoral plans or sectoral regulations, they need to be revisited from climate angle. The outcomes need to be redefined from climate angle, and the obligations and responsibilities of the nodal departments has to be measured in terms of actual climate impacts. But so in the second version of the state action plan, I think it will be critical to see how we are able to mainstream them into sectoral plans, how we are able to measure the impacts in terms of specific outcomes, and what is the financing framework which we can provide to the states. I'll stop here, and I think we will expect the panelists to tell us in terms of their experience of how the state action plans have performed in the past, in the last 10 years. What are the key learnings from here? What is it that we can learn from these lessons in terms of meeting the future challenges for mainstreaming climate change and providing an effective framework for national and state actions? I think with this I'll stop, and let me now first request Mr. Chandrabhushan to set the tone for the discussion and give us his perspective on the effectiveness and utility of state action plans. Over to you, Mr. Chandrabhushan.
Thank you very much, Rashmiji. And I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me. You have actually laid down the issues that I was going to talk about. I completely agree with, the sequence of the way the things happened on state action plan on climate change. On the hindsight, the issues that we realized were missing. And I think the presentation from MOEFCC has also captured some of the new things that we have been talking over the past couple of years in terms of strengthening the state action plan on climate change. Let me start by saying the first thing that, every plan is developed under certain context. The National Action Plan on Climate Change was developed under the context of Copenhagen Agreement. And it came about to showcase India's leadership on climate change. And at that point of time, it was felt that a mission approach would be a better way to deal with climate change, because we will be able to achieve something and show some development and some action on climate issues. Now, my first comment is that today I do not think that National Action Plan on Climate Change and its 8 missions, as they were conceptualized in 2008 onwards, is applicable today. We now need to have a much more comprehensive framework on adaptation and mitigation rather than a mission mode. So I believe that the National Action Plan is due for revision itself. I'll come back to State Action Plan later on, but there is fundamentally a need to look at National Action Plan itself. It has been, if one reviews the National Action Plan, you will find that plans which had very tangible targets, solar mission, for example, or energy efficiency mission, where there was also money and resources at the national level, have done very well. One can today claim that the target of solar mission has been met many folds. We started with 20 gigawatt and we are already 40 gigawatt solar installation today, and we are targeting much more going ahead. However, the adaptation missions, the progress on adaptation mission, whether it was Himalayan ecosystem or forest or agriculture or water, has not made that progress. And they have not made that progress precisely because you cannot have a standalone climate action plan for agriculture. And that's where mainstreaming comes into play. And I'm so happy that the ministry in its revision of SAPCC is now talking about mainstreaming of climate change. Now, coming back to SAPCC, I think the biggest contribution of SAPCC has been to increase the awareness about climate change adaptation issues at the state level. Some states have done very well, and I'm so happy that Lokendra is here. Madhya Pradesh took the lead, set up an institutional structure to work on climate change, which is extremely good, but the same kind of progress you do not see at in other states. However, increasing the awareness, I think that period is over now. The issue now is how do we take it into state plans themselves. Now, this is where I want to make some of the next steps that we need to do. I very, very strongly believe that while one can make an independent state action plan on climate change, which the revision will do, the climate change adaptation has to be mainstreamed in the state planning boards themselves. Every state today, whether you look at Tamil Nadu has a planning commission, Chhattisgarh has a planning board, that's where mainstreaming will happen. That's where also money and resources are accounted. So if we want mainstreaming to happen, then they have to be mainstreamed in the annual plan of the state themselves. Now, mainstreaming is a very big word. What does it mean? What are the guiding principles of mainstreaming? Because at the end of the day, when we tell a state to do mainstreaming, they will ask, what does it mean actually? How do I judge whether this project is, from climate perspective, better than the alternative? So we also need the development of very clear guiding principles on mainstreaming in adaptation. The second issue is, Rashmiji, we have had this discussion before. I always have disagreed that mitigation should be the preserve of center. I believe that many of the mitigation measures will also have to be taken down to the state level, whether it is energy efficiency. I think states have far bigger role on energy efficiency than Bureau of Energy Efficiency. At the end of the day, the State Electricity Board or a State Department for Energy Efficiencies are also working on these issues. So mitigations, I think a state action plan will have to start including mitigations themselves. Some of the states, for example, have already announced that they're not going to set up new coal-based power plants. Okay, I think these are great mitigation initiatives. These can be measured. Such big mitigation action at the state level is also very important, apart from the fact that center itself will set India's own goals on climate change mitigation. So two issues. One, that we need to take, though we can revise SAPCC, make an independent document, but those documents are as good as when a state planning boards or a state planning commission will take them up. Point number one. And therefore, that's where we have to make the effort. Point number two, we need to develop a clear defining definition and guiding principle for what mainstreaming actually means, how we will judge mainstreaming, how do we track the progress. That's the second issue. And the third issue is that mitigation has to become part of a state action plan on climate change itself. Some of our states are bigger than Germany. Okay, so and it is important that they have clear ownership on mitigation as well. The last point that I would like to make is, Rashmiji, over the last few months, as I have been working on just transition, I have gone back to the Constitution of India, okay, and have started looking at the debates of Constituent Assembly, and these are very rich debates. And unfortunately, my generation and the generation later on hasn't had the opportunity to see what our founding fathers had to say about planning. And our founding fathers had a lot to say about planning, not from 1947, but from 1938 onwards. From 1938, the Congress resolution was actually to set up planning commission at national and at the state level. Unfortunately, it was never included in constitution, and therefore planning commission was an extra constitutional body. But it was always, the desire of our founding fathers to have planning commission both at the state and the central level. But they also had the desire to have planning process at the district level, which actually got included under 73rd and 74th amendment of the Constitution. Now, I have the copy of Constitution with me, and I want to read this because it is important that we are forgetting something that we already have, and we have something which we can build for climate change. If you look at, there are 2 articles of the Constitution which actually says you don't need a state action plan, you need district action plan. Okay. Article 243G and Article 243W requires development of economic and social plans at the Panchayati Raj and urban local bodies level. These are constitutionally mandated requirements. These are not something, explained by something, a government directive. This is something which Constitution has asked us, mandated us to do. And Article 243ZD specify the constitution of district planning committee. Now, it is known that we have not allowed these articles and the local level governments to get involved in the planning process as is required by the Constitution. I therefore believe that going ahead, we will have to, while state action plans are great, while I think there is a value in developing a state action plan, our districts are as big as provinces of Europe. And districts are empowered to develop social and economic action plan. There are district planning commissions and committees that have been set up. Planning boards are there. We need to take climate change, adaptation. I'm not talking about mitigation. Maybe the adaptation part and mitigation part can go till the state level. But at least adaptation part will have to move down to the district level. That's where the biggest effort will have to be put. That's where civil society, state governments, international agencies should also focus on. That's where we can build the capacity. That's where what local actually means. That's where the action will take place. It will not take place in the state capitals. And therefore, that's another area of work where we all should focus on. Maybe that's where we will get the biggest mileage and work on climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chandrabhushan. It was extremely insightful, and you have laid out the contour of the future discussion. You said that we should rely on the state planning boards. They are the apex planning bodies in the state, and they should get into the business of bringing climate on board in the state planning process of planning developmental work in the state. That's how we can mainstream climate change better. And you also referred that states should have now a greater involvement in mitigation actions, both in terms of regulation as well as implementation. This is, I do agree with you to a large extent, but how this needs to be done is something which we need to discuss. And lastly, the point about taking the state action plans down to the district level, where we have constitutional bodies, as you say, the constitutional scheme of things, the local bodies are empowered to take actions. Of course, that is slightly debatable. And this is a question which we can pose to the panelists also. Perhaps it will be interesting to hear their perspective on this. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Let me now go over to Mr. Ashish Tiwari, who represents the biggest, one of the largest states in India, Mr. Uttar Pradesh, and he is Secretary in the Department of Environment.
So, Mr. Ashish Tiwari was called for an urgent meeting with the National Green Tribunal, so he will not be able to join.
Oh, I see. Okay. So, okay. I mean, then we'll be missing a great panelist, and we would have loved to hear him. So now let me go over to Mr. Thakkar. He's an outstanding person in the field of environment actions at the state level. Mr. Thakkar, let me invite you to give you perspective from Madhya Pradesh, and also you are free to give your views about the national scenario as well, as to how the state action plans need to be framed, what are the learnings, and how do you think we can mainstream state action, the climate into state action plans. Over to you.
Thank you very much, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this very important discussion. I'm very happy that the focus is back on the state as far as climate actions are concerned. I've been listening lots of webinar, participating as a delegate, as a speaker, as an audience on various issues, but this is, I think, one of the most important discussion on state action plan on climate change. So thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you, GIZ and Terry, for organizing this very important discussion. State action plan on climate change, as all speakers have said, is a very important document and can play a very important role in mainstreaming the climate actions at the state level. But the question is that whether in the last roughly 10 years, I think, sir, 2008, you were the first person in the ministry who led the entire process of developing the state action plans. And I must record it on, say it on record that because of your leadership at the ministry, the states have started learning the language of climate change. Otherwise, 10 years before, there was not much of understanding at the state level, especially maybe at the bureaucrats higher level, people are aware. But in the departments, this understanding was not there. It was absolutely missing. But come 2008, 2009, when the national plan was prepared, states were asked to develop these state action plans. And this is how we started our work in the climate change space. So thank you very much, sir, for building the capacities and posing the faith in the state government officials to develop such a beautiful plans. The question is that for the last 10 years, we have this state action plans. MP was one of the 4 states which were in the front runners and got their state action plans approved by the government of India in 2012-13, sir. So 7 or 8 years have gone by, and now we are talking of the revision of the second plan. I would like to simply take you for a moment to go back in the history that whether these plans have served any purpose of climate actions. I would say yes, because the plan making process itself was very exciting. State government got the opportunity to understand the nuances of climate change. We understood the language, the issues, the importance of mitigation, adaptation. But when it comes to action, sir, these are action plans. This is how the term goes, state action plan on climate change, whether we have been able to deliver, design some actions. And this is where I feel we are slightly disappointing, slightly discouraging, that we have not been able to implement the beautiful strategies and actions that we have mentioned in the state action plan. I think 5%, 10% implementation would be a very, ambitious figure. So my feeling is that the state action plan, with the enthusiasm and the response that we had got and we were preparing, at the time of the revisions, I personally don't have that kind of enthusiasm that I had in 2012. The reason being that there are many questions that are being asked, whether we are able to, as you mentioned about finance, this is the big problem. It is a plan without any funds, plan without finance. And this is where the plan doesn't get that kind of a response or a respect, because it's purely an academic document, which we have developed without any plan of funds. So this time around also, we keep hearing from the ministry that there may not be a possibility of funding these state action plans. For funding, we have to go to the GCF or to NAPCC. NAPCC is a very small domestic fund. 25 crores is the highest maximum cap. For making a GCF project at the state level is a very difficult task. Therefore, I'm slightly disappointed that unless we link some major funds to state action plans, these plans will remain beautiful academic documents again in the phase 2. Second thing I'm giving you earthworm perspective. You are all in Delhi, you have a bird's eye view. I'm giving you earthworm perspective. The second thing is that the state action plans are supposed to be aligned with NDCs. Not all of us know that NDCs are largely mitigation oriented. There is no target given specific to any states. Yet we have to align the state action plans to NDCs. Second thing is this, that states are not allowed to carry out their own greenhouse gas inventories. Without even knowing what are the levels of emissions in different sectors, how do we design our strategies for mitigation? This is a second challenge that we are facing. The third thing is that all the national missions have their line ministry. I just quote one example that there is a national mission on National Action Plan on Climate Change and Human Health, which is being steered by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. Now, Health Department in Madhya Pradesh already has set up a meet committee to develop a state action plan on climate change and human health. Similarly, Green India Mission has a green document. National Water Mission has asked their state partner counterpart to develop the state action plan on water and climate change. These guys are struggling for the last 5 years. They got 50 lakhs as an amount to develop the plans, but the Water Resource Department is not able to develop a plan. So in the states, we have different pockets. Water Ministry, Health Ministry, Forest Ministry, all these have their independent plans which are aligning to their respective national missions. Now it is a challenge for somebody in the Environment Department to prepare a state action plan which not only aligns with the NDC, not only aligns with the state policies and actions and SDG and the Sendai framework and all the national, international the commitments and the negotiations that Government of India has made, but we have to also align with their respective mission documents. Therefore, the validity, the respect for the state action plan is something which is questionable. We just don't know what this state action plan is going to do in the next 5 years. Who is going to own it up? The question is, who owns it? There is no ownership. I take this point from Chandrabhushan ji when he says that the State Planning Commission is the agency where you can actually mainstream climate change concerns. But honestly, state planning boards are not that powerful structure today. It is the finance department which calls the shots. It is not the state planning boards. So what has happened in the last, after Niti Aayog has been set up in Government of India, the state planning boards have, in a sense, at least I can speak from Madhya Pradesh, have very limited role in planning process because the funds are being managed and controlled by the finance department. Again, whatever is being planned in the state planning board remains a beautiful academic document. Therefore, the challenge of mainstreaming is still very much there. As sir, you talked about monitoring and evaluation. Again, we can monitor and evaluate something which we pay for. We are at the Department of Environment, we can plan for their activities, but we are not funding their actions. So how do we monitor? And what is to be monitored? For monitoring and evaluation, we need criteria and indicators. Do we have those criteria indicators that on which we can monitor? One of the indicator for in the government system is that how much money you've been able to spend. That's the one indicator which is used to project our achievement in terms of targets or not. We don't have any funds. So my worry and my questions and my submission is that how can we restore that kind of a respect for state action plan for climate change? This is one more document. As we have a SDG document, we have a Sendai framework document at the state level. This will also be one more document. So if we really want to make this state action plan a key document for mainstreaming of climate actions, we will have to allocate certain resources. And the states are today, after this COVID pandemic, are really in a dire situations. They don't have funds for climate actions. So we have to simply calculate the amount of expenditure funds being spent on various activities by different departments. If agriculture is doing some drought resistant varieties of seeds are being distributed, we just count it. If there are certain wetlands are being conserved by some department, we can count it as a climate actions. But do we have any separate resource, separate budget for it? We don't have. And therefore, I think this is going to be a challenge. The last thing that I want to say is that a climate action plan has three major ingredients. Number one, that it should have a climate projections and climate modeling and how climate is going to change or behave in a particular region. 10 years before, we didn't have this information. Right now, IITM is supporting all of us so that we have this information. It took 10, 12 years to develop a common framework for assessing the vulnerability to climate change. Thanks to DST and the team, they have recently come out with a common framework. Otherwise, we didn't have any information as to how the different sectors or different ecosystems are going to be vulnerable. So these two things are there. The last is the greenhouse gas inventory for designing the mitigation strategies. This information is not available to us, and neither we are encouraged to do that. Therefore, my submission is that we want to, if you want to give that kind of importance and use this SAPCC document as a mainstreaming tool for climate actions, we will have to allocate certain resources, and therefore we can actually monitor and evaluate the implementation of SAPCC. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Thakur Saab. Thank you for giving us this view from the ground. You have really hit the nail when you said that there are no funds associated with the state action plan, nor are there any targets, specific targets for the sectoral targets to be monitored. So what is it that we do and measure? And you made this point about the states being allowed to drop their GHG inventory. I think this is a valid expectation, and it is important. I'm sure Dr. Bose, who is listening to this, will take it on board and reflect the aspirations and expectations that unless the states are given the flexibility and the freedom to think of what kind of climate actions should be accorded priority, we should avoid, it will not make much headway. So we should avoid state jacketing their actions and their vision. So it's extremely important to provide necessary resources and set the targets. But Mr. Thakur, I will come down. I think when we go to the question and answer session, I'll also pose a question to the other participants, whether we can have a binary approach to the resources and to the targets. So before we discuss this, let me first go over to the next participant, next panelist, Dr. Suresh Chandra Atri from Himachal Pradesh. And Mr. Atri, you are welcome to give us your perspective and to address this central question of how do you think mainstreaming can be done, and what is it that you can provide to us in terms of lessons from your state government. Over to you, Mr. Atri.
Thank you very much, sir. It's a really privilege to be with you today, sir. Under your chairmanship, this panel is discussing various things. Respected Mr. Mohammad Khawat, Cluster Coordinator, Government of Germany. Mr. Philip Neal, Head of India and South Asia, German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation, BMZ. Rajshri, the Advisor, Ministry of Environment and Forest, Dr. Bose. Indeed, very respected Rashmi sir, the head of the panel discussions chair, Mr. Chandra Bhushan, CEO I4S, Mr. Lokendra Thakur, counterpart from state of Madhya Pradesh, and Pritiman Avasthi, Soumya, I hope Ashish Chaturvedi is also present. So respected sir, thanks to you as well. I, on behalf of Government of Himachal Pradesh from Indian Himalayan region, extend my thanks to all for inviting me to be part of this webinar and let the state of Himachal Pradesh, express its, what we have done so far. Yes, what Mr. Thakur has just said about the, more of the challenges part he has covered. I would also focus on the, the best what we have done so far from with the help of the national government, the international agencies, and what we could achieve through these, state climate change action plans, and how the adaptation, we were able to mainstream that into the local level planning. As already everyone has said, that climate change is not a distant, it's a potential threat, and it is already affecting millions of lives across the globe. The most devastating impact of climate change and extreme weather is being manifested in its impact on our ecosystem, communities, and the global economy as a whole, which is dreadful. So, increasing vulnerability due to climate change are multidimensional and also interlinked. It varies across locations, sectors, and not only the sectors, but the communities, even at the household level also, even the individuals. When you speak about the gender, it affects and it has impact, and the vulnerabilities are increasing. Our state, Himachal Pradesh, is endowed with unique Himalayan ecosystem. It is a Himalayan heritage and is often described as a abode of gods. However, our fragile ecology makes us very vulnerable to environmental degradation due to impacts of climate change and many other anthropogenic factors, like excessive greenhouse gas emissions, volatile, like associated with climate change, and certain economic practices adversely, affecting us, the entire ecosystem. It is therefore very important that we should have very clear-cut adaptation and mitigation strategy towards climate change issues, and we must be, we should have integral part of, we should make the adaptation planning and the mitigation strategy as well the integral part, of the developmental trajectory of our developmental process. State of Himachal Pradesh is committed to a very holistic approach to address the climate change challenges. We strongly believe that there is a need to protect the environment and strengthen our energy security and spur economic growth through continued efforts and sustained actions as well. We believe that, when Rashmi sir, as you said in the beginning, that the resources and the funds, funding of climate change action plans, we realized it. Yes, the process of evolving the climate change action plan under your leadership from the national level, the perspective which we learned from international, process, were up, on the different side, but the funding and other things, those were things very far off. That time it was only the framework which was, was being deliberated in 2009 when this journey was started after the national level climate change action plan was in place. So that time this knowledge was not even available with the, what to do, how to do, and how to go about it. Our sectors, our, stakeholder departments were not at all aware of the process or, the kind of, the planning perspective about the climate change strategy. But this was a long journey, sir, indeed. Now we are looking at the revision of the state climate change action plan. We are trying to mainstream things, so things have merged positively. We have learned with the time, with the passage, the saplings which you sow at that point of time have started giving fruits as well. We have certain showcase best practices as well, which we can, very confidently say that we have done something. We are able to achieve something through this climate change action plan. I believe that there was no restriction by Government of India in
I think we have lost him. We can't. Dhriti or Mekhla, do you have any solution? I can't hear anything.
So I don't think we can hear him either. I think we've lost him too.
You've lost him.
Maybe we will email him and get in touch with him personally.
Okay, great. I'm on it.
Okay. If we don't get him back, maybe we can go to the next panelist, and in the meantime, then when he joins us back, we can let him complete. Is that okay?
Yes, sir. Sure, sir.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry for this glitch. While we are waiting for Mr. Atri to join us, can I request Dr. Indumurthy from C-Step 2 talk about the state action plans, what she thinks from her perspective is missing, what is it that needs to be done? Dr. Murthy. Can you hear us, Dr. Murthy? Yes, I can see your presentation. And I think in the interest of economy of time, I'll request if you could, encapsulate it in your time for about 7-8 minutes so that we can complete.
Definitely, sir. Yes, definitely, sir. I will do that. I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just kind of stepping back from, the issues of developing a state action plan and then, how it was developed versus what happened on the ground to, the need for district level plans, so on and so forth. So I just thought I can bring in the academic perspective. Do we really have these mainstreaming tools that we are talking about in the first place? And then also kind of go forward and say what would be required if we need to go down to a district level plan. So now the price is already set, and also it's very clearly recognized that developmental planning and adaptation go hand in hand. They're interdependent. So supporting one is essential to ensure that development is going on in the pathway that it's been chalked out for. And countries have been formulating national adaptation strategies to meet this challenge. However, as it's been said by my esteemed panelist colleagues earlier, on the ground implementation has suffered because of multiple reasons, as it's been explained also. Now, broadly, if you look at the mainstreaming approach, people do talk about identifying current vulnerabilities and then, evaluating the need for modifying a plan. So when we look at this entire process, the first two have performed pretty much well because there are enough tools that have been developed over the past decade or so, where people have been able to pinpoint what are the current or future vulnerabilities, and also the evaluating the need for modifying the plan. But then when it came to identifying and selecting options, now this is where it gets a little complex. And of course, the final step of evaluation of adaptation being a success or not is a huge gap in itself, which I will speak about in a short while. Now, scientific approaches and tools, as I said, multitude of them. Some of them are general guidance documents, some are screening tools specifically that have been developed for looking at, project by project or program specific. Or there are also portfolio screening tools. This is not an exhaustive list, just a few examples, of course, that have been developed over the decade. So there is no dearth of such tools. So as I said, the first part of it is taken care of. But then what challenges remain is the question of where and when to intervene. That is something that people on the ground are grappling with. And also the extent of knowledge and awareness of climate change issues at different levels. Now, with the state action plan, at the state level, like Mr. Tucker, Lokendra Tucker was saying, that awareness has been built. So people and states are already kind of recognizing this as an issue. But when you move down the ladder, we do see that there are certain gaps yet. And of course, availability or accessibility of information, reliable information at different scales is also another challenge. That's kind of, been a hurdle to this transition. And of course, yes, climate change experts are there and there is information. There is a whole lot of climate change projection information that's being generated. But then how is it being communicated? So how is it being translated to the language that is required for decision making? Now that's again a gap. So the way it is presented is what would enable the user to perceive it in a manner that is useful for planning, which is seen as a huge gap in itself. Now, SAPCCs in their current form, as we know, is focused on a state and it's quite sectoral in its approach. But then given the diversity and variability in a climate, economic, social conditions that could vary even across a single state, right? So SAPCC works well in giving the direction to what needs to be done. So the question that's being talked about that my fellow panelists and the chair himself also touched upon is there a way to transition towards preparing, say, a subnational, sub-regional level, a district or a block or even a village level plan? So now when we try to look at this particular question, so I asked myself this question: what would it take to downscale the action plan on climate change? Remove the state, get it into an action plan at a different scale. Now, one, of course, would be the information capacity that needs to be dealt with, which ranges from availability of information at the scale that a plan is being developed to translation of that information, communication, access, knowledge, awareness, so on and so forth, and all of this being credible and reliable set of information. Now, the second set of capacities that would be very important to build for this to happen would be the kind of institutional commitments and leadership that is required at those scales. And as very nicely put earlier, the autonomy of the local governments, as well as the community support and the cohesion that exists at those scales needs to be very strong for it to actually take off. Now, intersectoral, interplanning positions that need to be cohesive, that need to kind of synergize action is something that definitely has to be in place. And of course, one huge gap which has been there right from the beginning of this SAPCC being conceived has been the resource capacity. Now, even for states, there is a gap with respect to the finance that's available for actually implementing the plan that they have put together. So how does it trickle down when it comes to access to funds or stability of resource flow? When I say resource flow, one is the financial resources. The second would be availability of the kind of expert knowledge that could go in and trickle down to a district level or a village level, and also human resource that would be required to implement such plans. So that would need to be really strengthened to downscale the kind of plans we are looking at today at a state level down up till a block or even a village level. Now, a local action plan, of course, Himachal has been a forerunner, like Mr. Atri was saying. Even in Kerala, post the flood, they did come up with the local action plan on climate change, where the eco development committees and the Vanasamrakshana Samitis, VSs, have been mandated with putting together plans with I think a 5-year validity, and also coming up with annual plans, which they say is being supported with resources. So people have been experimenting across the country with respect to developing plans at a sub-regional level, but they've been largely pilots. Now, you can develop plans, you can mainstream, you can kind of identify things, but then I guess what would be very, very important would be to identify the exact entry points and target groups. Basically, when you're thinking of mainstreaming, I think the challenge is to identify which program or project where mainstreaming can actually build upon. See, many of these are not something new that one needs to put together. It all depends on how you are implementing a certain program. A lot of them have an adaptation component that's inbuilt, but then it has to be done right. It has to be tweaked to deliver the kind of benefits that adaptation is required. So what are the crucial steps? and who makes or prepares these decisions would be at the heart of developing a action plan at a village or even at a district level for that matter. Now, take NREG as an example. Now, just as an example, I put this because, there's a whole lot of steps that goes in before, the labor budget, which is the final step where, the approval for works actually happens. Now, one needs to clearly identify where one can intervene. Where could you actually introduce this? Now, as we all know, there is a permissible list of works under NREG. So the entry point will have to be there. One has to look at preparation of climate resilient permissible list of works, right from there to ensuring that it's selected at the village level, which means you need to build, arm the village communities with the kind of climate information that's required for them to help in identifying the challenges that could crop up in the future. And then keeping that in mind, they should be able to select these kind of works. And of course, at the district level, an awareness is agreed, is definitely needed, because they are the ones who would actually approve it at the end of the day. But all of this requires access to information. That's the crux of this, access to information at the scale that it's being implemented. So now, yes, you could do it, but provided the information becomes available at that particular scale. Now, there was also this talk as we were discussing earlier as to how do we synergistically promote mitigation and adaptation at a state level. Now, it's a good idea to integrate this and so that it's ensured and it's aligned to the national goals and commitments. However, as rightly put by Mr. Tucker, when an inventory is not done at the state level, how do you tie it up with mitigation actions? So that's a challenge. So one has to do that to map it right to the action at the end of the day. Of course, one of the things that definitely provides this dual opportunity of addressing both mitigation and adaptation is what is popularly called NBS now, or nature-based solutions, where be it waste, be it water management, or be it the other issues that every city, every region faces. These provide opportunities for promoting both mitigation and adaptation in a synergistic manner. So one could kind of push for these kind of solutions at the end of the day. And of course, there was this question about, okay, we've done a whole lot of things. How do we measure them? Monitoring and evaluation, is it just about numbers? Are we talking only about how much is spent, where, how, or what has been spent? So basically, I think the biggest requirement is templates which can clearly map the vulnerabilities with the measures that are proposed or undertaken, and then the stock take has to happen if the proposed measures have delivered what they have been originally conceived for. But this is quite tricky, of course, when it comes to adaptation, because it's a dynamic baseline that we are looking at. Because if you implement something, you could measure it in the first instant, but as time passes, your base measure becomes very different. So it's a kind of a complicated monitoring and evaluation system that might have to be put in place, keeping in mind, being cognizant of the fact that a whole lot of other developments could also influence the change. So attribution and also ensuring the right kind of metrics. Now, adaptation metrics is a huge gap in itself, as somebody in the chat has already flagged it. How do you measure? Where are the indicators? What is the criteria that needs to be put in place? So this, if you are looking at incremental adaptation, is quite complex. But then there is another level of complexity that arises when adaptation is transformational. So there's a complete change. So what is your base case? Do you think the new one is better than the other? Who decides? So that again is a huge challenge in itself. Now, obviously, there are multi-level indicators, strata that might have to be identified. Some of them national level indicators, some that are sectoral at a state or a district level, and some institutional level indicators that might need to be put in place. I did come across one nice example which looks at these two boxes very clearly. One track which measures climate risk management, where you're looking at institution policies and capacities, and then trying to see how it's kind of made a difference with the kind of implementation that has come in. The other is set is to do with the change in the vulnerability indicators, which a lot of states are already doing. So a combination of these two is something that should kind of guide the M&E process. Now, it's easier said than done, primarily because, even the National Inventory Management System, NIMS at a national level, which is for the national communication, is still being developed. So now if we are looking at developing this kind of a framework, which is common to all the places, it's a challenge. How do you reflect the diversity? How do you reflect the variabilities? Or are we going to go case by case? So, and if that is the case, then how do you kind of compare one against the other? So in any case, to even before getting there, the key enablers, given that mainstreaming is multifaceted, challenging, and would take place over medium to long time frames, with multiple actors and institutions involved, the first step towards it would be to provide the kind of information that's required at that particular scale, and continued efforts, commitment, and political will that would be required with respect to, say, leadership, coordination mechanisms, tools, information, financial processes, and a whole lot of things that need to be put in place before we could actually migrate or transition towards sub-regional plans. That is actually the need of the hour. So with this, I would like to conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Murthy. Thank you for a very very comprehensive presentation on the issues involved in downscaling the state action plans and building the required framework. You mentioned very succinctly the framework of institutions, the information, and the resources. You have to look at these three dimensions to be able to evolve a good framework for district or regional action plans. So thank you very much for this perspective. This is extremely useful. Now let me go over to Mr. Kirtiman Avasthi, who is leading the international cooperation issues from GIZ. From GIZ perspective, how he looks at this in the light of his experience of having worked with some of the states. Mr. Avasthi, we have almost reached the end of the time, so I'll request you to be economical with your time. Over to you. You are not audible. Oh, somebody is. Dr. Murthy, can you stop sharing your screen so that Mr. Avasthi can?
I've already stopped, sir.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Kirtiman.
Sir, I think you are on.
We can't hear him.
Mr. Avasthi, I think you are on mute, sir.
Can anybody help in resolving this problem? Can you call Meghla? Can you call Kirtiman?
Yes, sir. I'm just on.
Hello.
Yes.
Can you hear me, sir?
Yes. Now you are audible. Yes.
Okay.
Finally.
Okay.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I think a lot has been said about the SAPCC. So I'll just at least there's one agreement or general consensus about that the state actions, the subnational actions are the primary driver of climate action at the state level, and SAPCC provides that opportunity. And there are certainly challenges, and primarily challenges due to the lack of dedicated funding, and which has been raised multiple times. But SAPCC actually also or rather subnational action plans also provides an opportunity to enhance or accelerate climate action. And if I remember correctly and not mistaken, this subnational actions have found some traction in the discourse at the UNFCCC platform as well. I think way back in 2012, there's a reference about recognizing subnational action on climate action. And I think India has shown early leadership, both at the national and state level as well, by coming out with the State Action Plan on Climate Change as early as 2010. And since the process has evolved, the thinking has evolved, the understanding has evolved, first with the development on, now with the revision process. But one thing to me, which is clear based on the experience of engaging with multiple state governments on this process of SAPCC, from the SAPCC development, as well as working with the state partners on operationalizing SAPCC, that the subnational plans, the SAPCCs actually provides or has emerged as a laboratory for innovation. Laboratory for innovation, development of new concept, and also implementation of climate action. And especially in the new reality when we are looking at revision of SAPCC in terms of achieving the NDC commitments and also looking at mainstreaming process. Chandrabhushan talked about how can we actually look at mainstreaming, and unless by focusing on, let's say, planning board or planning commission or planning department. I think there are multiple pathways which exist when it comes to mainstreaming. And then one of the pathway is also through this 73rd and 74th constitutional amendment, which also Chandrabhushan talked about. And I was looking at this, one of the comment in the chat box by Ramit Basu, which talks about aligning with GPDP process. So these are some of the opportunities actually which exist, which allows further localizing, downscaling the state action plan on climate change and provide possible pathways for mainstreaming. However, when it comes to SAPCC, in fact, with the SAPCC, the first version actually came up. Of course, the understanding was evolving about the climate science, climate vulnerability, and adaptation. Even in the first version of SAPCC, many states actually identified number of key restrainers or challenge which needs to be overcome for successful implementation of SAPCC. And I think those challenges are still there, apart from, of course, additional challenge of is financing, funding this SAPCC. And these working on these challenges, overcoming these challenges actually provide the opportunity for cooperation at the state level, at the sub-national level, when it comes to working on the state action plan on climate change. Some of these, the key challenges, and I would call them the key enablers, key enabling conditions, if they are addressed, will support SAPCC implementation and enhanced action on climate change at the state level, is data information. And in fact, a lot has been said already about data information, whether the data requirement for further downscaling climate vulnerability and risk assessment in terms of monitoring and evaluation and so on and so forth. So data information, generating more and more evidence on vulnerability and climate risk by bringing different research and scientific organizations together. There was a critique about the earlier version of SAPCC about that the whole climate science was based on the INCA report or more at a macro level. And I think since then a lot has evolved in terms of climate science, and there's a robust science and information available which can be used for further downscaling. Capacity development is another key enabler across, not at the state level, but I think across a different level of governance at the district and at the level below at the panchayat level. To strengthen further participatory planning to mains, and so that the mainstream integration of climate concerns can be integrated into the planning process at the lowest level. Accessing and mobilizing climate finance is certainly an issue, and this is also enabler and also opportunity of engagement, collaboration on SAPCC. We're looking at innovative ways of mobilizing both public and private climate finance, and there's a lot of opportunity exists on this particular topic as well. One of the way of accessing mobilizing climate finance is also leveraging from the different development schemes and plans. And one of the example that Dr. Indumurthy talked about is Engineering. And I think by going further down, localizing adaptation planning, this could also be made possible. Promoting innovative and locally suited technology to support adaptation action is also one of the key enabler through technology need assessment by demonstrating certain innovative technology through pilot projects also based on the SAPCC priorities can will also be work as an enabler. I think one of the key enabler is all to have this demonstrated leadership of a nodal department. So strengthening the role of the nodal department for coordinated action, which can bring different departments and agencies together for coordinated action, is also one of the key enabler. Madhya Pradesh did identify that in the SAPCC first version, the whole institutional arrangement and clarifying in the planning process. And I think to be states like Himachal Pradesh actually have demonstrated that. Unfortunately, we could not hear Dr. Atri fully, but I think DEST in Himachal Pradesh has shown that kind of leadership in terms of bringing different forward coordinated action by bringing different departments and agencies together. And last but not the least is this multi-stakeholder stakeholder engagement. This is also a key enabler which requires which actually provides opportunity for collaboration and at a different level, both vertical collaboration and also horizontal, state level, also national and international level. GIZ has been working with the states on addressing or strengthening some of these key enablers. For example, developing or strengthening a multi-stakeholder knowledge platform. And in the partner states of UP and HP, we've been supporting the nodal department in putting this knowledge network together. In fact, Himachal Pradesh did notify, re-notify rather, a state-level platform on DRR and climate change adaptation earlier this year. In terms of generating evidence and vulnerability in climate risk assessment, for example, we work closely with the state partners in putting this collaborative research together to bring out sound scientific assessment and like on climate using the latest science and methodological guidance of risk-based assessment in both the state in HP and UP, and of course in other states. And these are some of the enablers we thought that actually provides opportunity for cooperation, and that's why to me it becomes a laboratory for innovation, development and implementation, to sum up.
Thank you, Kirtiman. Thanks very much for your broad reference to several enablers which can help states evolve an effective state action plan, and also about what the international agencies are doing in this field. We have come to the end of this session. We lost Mr. Atri on the way, but he's now back with us.
So, Dr.
Yes. I've just seen this. Mr. Atri is back with us. So what I'll do is now we'll move into the question and answer session, and we have got a few questions. In fact, the chat box is quite active now, and broadly, a number of listeners and the participant attendees are in agreement with what the panelists have said. They have generally endorsed this idea about the downscaling of the state action plans. They think they are in agreement with Mr. Chandrabhushan and others that and Dr. Murthy also said this, that one of the ways of mainstreaming is to involve the district level bodies in preparing and implementing an action plan for climate change. It's a good way of doing that. But we will have to look at, as Dr. Murthy was saying, three things: institutions, information, and also the resources for this action plan to be effective at the regional or district level. there are other questions, specific questions, which I think I'll pose to the panelists. And the first one, I'll go back to Mr. Atri, since he is back with us. Ms. Rita, just a moment. Richa Khandelwal, she has raised a question about, she asked that many panelists did talk about, Mr. Thakur talked about, and Mr. Atri also talked about, that state action plans, even if they have not been funded well, they have actually created a lot of awareness about climate change issues at the state level, which was practically absent, just non-existent in 2010, when all this began. But today we have a very active civil society, a very active discussion on climate change going on inside the government at the state level. There are many gaps here, but since we are talking about building awareness and advancing actions at the state level, can Mr. Atri tell us in what way does he think that Himachal Pradesh, what are the key examples of successful interventions in terms of climate, which you can cite for the panelists? Quickly, in about 1 or 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. I'm really sorry that there's a technology and I just got disrupted because of some signal problem. Yes, in fact, government of Himachal Pradesh, has a very strong political will, which I would say would help us in grounding the climate activities, actions in the state. What we have started is, I wanted to mention one important point, not only the funds, not only the resources, but the climate data is also equally important when you come to downscale the the planning prospect, the planning perspectives. When you plan things, you need to have correct data and current understanding of the vulnerabilities at local level. So that is another challenge which all the states, I think, face very big way, and that needs to be addressed. So at state level, because our state is ecologically very sensitive, the climate change impacts are very significantly observed in terms of glacier melt, and our agriculture is around 90% rain fed, and 80% population lives in rural area, which is directly depending upon for their livelihood in these sectors. So what we did was we prioritized the agriculture, horticulture, which is the mainstay for the economy. And we started the adaptation measures at local level from these sectors. And we could successfully, demonstrate that how the moisture management, the landscape management, and the micro watershed planning could, be successfully implemented. And that is the one area where we have good demonstration, and we can showcase Himachal as one of the very good example, which has done economically very well from this sector and securing the livelihood of people.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you so much, Dr. Atri. There is a question from Mr. Pradyumna. He's Pradyum Rana. He has talked about two issues actually. One is about the quantifiable indicators, which we can build into the state action plans, and the other is about how we can leverage funds for implementing state actions. Many of you have already touched upon these two issues, but if there is any one, Mr. Thakur, you did talk about target setting, but you said that target setting and monitoring by environment department may not be effective unless there are funds. So the question has more or less been partly answered. But there is a question here, Mr. Thakur, which I can engage with you. At the national level, when we talk about climate change actions, one issue is about the setting of targets. So if you build the climate actions into the regulatory framework, then financing is not your concern. Then financing becomes the concern of the persons who are implementing it. they're under an obligation to implement it, and they have to find the resources for this. It becomes the statutory obligation. The other way is that you make a plan, you lay down the activities to be undertaken, and then you provide the resources. So what we are talking about in the state action plans currently is about a financing plan for the activities in different sectors. But can we also think of, at the state level, having sectoral regulations in terms of climate change targets and climate change outcomes, which we can mandate to the nodal departments? Is it possible?
Sir, it is possible, but then it will have to be a consensus based. All the departments will have to agree to take certain targets and agree to implement the activities. Otherwise, my other idea is that, like, you have the National Health Mission or there must be a national mission, one mission. It's not 5 mission, national mission on climate change, but I think there should be one mission for implementation, and that mission should be given the responsibility to implement the climate actions in the state, and certain funds should be allocated. Otherwise, everybody's business is nobody's business. Right now, what is happening is the climate change is becoming everybody's business. Forest has certain things to do. Agriculture is doing with the sustainable agriculture mission. Mitigation missions, as Chandrabhushan ji has talked about, is performing well. But regarding adaptation missions, nothing is happening in ground, which we can actually quantify, or we can actually calculate that what amount of work has been done to adapt, to enhance the adaptive capacity of the people or the sector. Therefore, my submission is, sir, that we should have a state level, a national mission for implementation of climate actions at the Government of India level, and we should have state missions, and these missions should be sufficiently provided with funds and resources so that they can distribute the funds to the different departments and get the projects done. Otherwise, what will happen if you ask the departments to carry out their activities, and we will remain just a mainstreaming organizations. So mainstreaming is a agenda which is very, very, something which we need to address in a different way. So I think in order to take some real concrete ground actions, we need certain new climate governance structure architecture at the state and national levels.
Okay, essentially you are recommending some kind of a financing framework or a plan. There is a national adaptation.
I just want to take 30 seconds more, sir, if you permission. So funds may not be also a problem, because national mission, all these sectoral national missions have certain amount of funds available, but they are routed through their respective ministries and line departments in their states counterparts. So state action plan remains an isolated entity. My submission is that all the funds which are being transferred to the states by different national sectoral missions, they should be channelized through a certain mechanism so that we can actually be part of that loop. Otherwise, Department of Environment prepares the state action plan, and then we don't know what is happening in Green India Mission, or what is happening in National Water Mission, or in Health Mission, or Sustainable Agriculture Mission. So that reporting mechanism perhaps may be routed through that department.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Thakur, for this. In fact, that will require some kind of a climate budgeting exercise in the respective nodal ministries at the national level. They need to have to identify very clearly what is the climate budget segment, which they can then transfer, if agreed, to the respective state agencies for this purpose. Mr. Chandrabhushan, this brings us to the another question of, can we have targets in terms of adaptation as part of the NDCs, and whether you would agree with what Mr. Thakur is recommending?
In fact, I wanted to say that last year, one of the projects on which I worked was to look at, if India were to enact a climate law, what would that law look like? And this is the report. I would encourage you to have a look at this report. And when we started reviewing laws which are already there, Rashmiji, 80% of the law that is required on adaptation and mitigation exists, but they are in sectoral form. So we recommended essentially a framework climate law, which actually stitches together the existing laws. So as Mr. Thakkar said, we need a new framework for climate governance. The current framework of climate governance is extremely fragmented. And that's where the funding is also fragmented. It is not that departments don't have funding. Okay, if many of, in fact, in some of the states, I could say the work that is happening on minor irrigation to, waterproofing to land proofing, they all will qualify for good adaptation projects. Okay, it's just that we have not accounted them as climate projects. So there is funding already available at the state level for doing the kind of things as we all would consider as climate adaptation. I think it will require another discussion on this framework climate law and what it should be. But I think the idea of looking at climate governance is a very important intervention from Mr. Thakkar, and I think we should focus on that.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Devotion. It's the whole exercise is aimed at evolving these new thoughts and ideas, which we can take and incorporate into our future actions. Thanks very much for highlighting this. I think with this last intervention, we don't have any further time. Actually, we are already on extended time. I would like to thank all the panelists for their extremely insightful, constructive suggestions at how the state action plans are being implemented and how they look at the future in terms of evolution of the next round of state action plans. This was an extremely enriching discussion, and we have learned a number of new ideas have come, which I'm sure the government, Dr. Bose and others are listening to, and they will take this on board for the purpose of making the whole process of drafting the state action plans much more meaningful and useful. Thank you once again, all the panelists, and back to Meghla for your interventions.
Thank you, sir. I now hand it over to Dr. Ashish Chaturvedi, Director of Climate Change and Circular Economy at GIZ, for his closing remarks.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me, Meghla. And fascinating to hear the sort of insights of the panelists. I would have loved to be on the panel, but I was busy in another event and so kind of popped in. That's the beauty of our digital world. You can actually be in multiple places at the same time. I think there is lots of work to be done, and that's why, as part of Indo-German development cooperation, technical cooperation, we've been working with a bunch of these states. So delighted to see both Mr. Ratri as well as Mr. Thakkar. With both the states, we work with extensively. And of course, these guys are front runners in the dialogue on climate governance at the subnational level. I think the fundamental sort of problems or challenges that we've kind of encountered, but I think there is a great amount of sort of innovation which has happened as a result of the state action plans and climate change as well. And the topics that have come up, like for instance, we are currently working in Himachal Pradesh on with Gram Panchayat development plans and training of the entire GPDP sort of apparatus in the next few months. And this is something which is like really looking forward to kind of strengthen the capacities at the Gram Panchayat level and engaging with audiences and local sort of stakeholder groups to really think about downscaling in a sort of a pragmatic way. Also working on tools related to monitoring and evaluation of the state action plans on climate change for both Himachal Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh, which could potentially create models which could be replicated elsewhere as well. And finally, this point of financing, I would really like to kind of yeah, it's fascinating, and I'm sure Mr. Rashmi sort of mentioned it already. Lokendra has his own view on it. I think there are enough and more resources available, and with a tweak of the sort of the governance structure, and maybe not even the governance structure sounds bulky and sort of massive. No? If you really think about how the agencies which are currently at the helm of affairs for monitoring or for implementation of the state action plan on climate change, I think they need to be strengthened, and maybe that entire structure needs to be looked at a little bit more carefully. The role of the nodal agency, the role of the chief secretary's office, and the role of the chief minister's office. I think there were suggestions in the initial design. It would be good to kind of reevaluate that governance structure, which was sort of proposed. The role of the state chief secretary, well, the chief minister's office, when it comes to monitoring of the state action plans on climate change, the Chief Secretary's office. I think if that can be strengthened, that structure can, and I think the states which are doing well have, and especially I think I can speak for Himachal Pradesh, it's very easy to actually bring the attention of the Chief Minister on the issues of implementation of the state action plan on climate change, and that can actually deliver significant results on the ground. And I think that if something like that can be worked out in not only sort of in idiosyncratic ways, but in sort of structural ways, I think that would be brilliant. But I should shut up because I think, as CB said, we need another discussion on this and another sort of longer discussion. And maybe that's something which we could convene later on. I'd like to thank all of you on behalf of GIZ Ministry as well as Terry for being here for these really insightful discussions. And I hope that all of you go back with some learnings. And of course, we go back sort of very excited about the work that we're doing and to continue creating the models that we are trying to create in partnership with the Government of India as well as with the state governments. So with that sort of breathless intervention, back to you, Mekhla.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Chaturvedi. I want to thank everybody, our panelists and speakers for today, and also our attendees for being a part of this webinar. Please do visit our website and follow us on social media for more updates on the upcoming conference. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.